All right, hello everyone. Today we are going to look at, I forgot to move it back here, women in art in the 19th century. And this is part one of several. We're going to be looking at a few different areas. So this is not all encompassing and not all that we're going to look at in the 19th century. So for topics, what we're looking at, we have some the lines that were already there, some background information on kind of the changing roles of women. And also competing views of women is probably a good word choice for it, if you will, because as much as women's roles were changing and there was acceptance of kind of additional roles for women, there was still the older kind of traditional domestic role and view of women in art and how that, of course, impacts art. And we'll be looking at this in a few different ways with different women artists. So if you're looking at like kind of the traditional artwork, one of the big changes that is just starting at this point and then is going to continue through the 19th and then especially the 20th century is looking at middle class and working class individuals. Art, especially what was presented through the academies and the school, was all about portraits of the wealthy, of nobility, or the king and queen, the royals. For example, in this artwork here, this is Queen Victoria and her family, and certainly fits that good view and expectation of not only, of course, an upper class family, but that even as a royal, right, she's being shown in this domestic role as a mother, as that kind of priority over everything else. So here you can see the emphasis is with showcasing her children and in a family setting in the domestic sphere rather than showing her ruling, right, and running the government. And then, so those are the topics we're going to be looking at. So changes in art and representation. Again, there were several changes to art during this period. Of course, women still face barriers to formal art education. That doesn't go away for a little bit. Eventually, that will not be a barrier anymore. As in fact, we talked about in the introduction that women actually outnumber the number of men in art school now today. But it was a long-standing problem for women during these periods, and that had not changed. It was, as much as there's going to be a continued expansion and women pushing into these areas, it's still something that women often found themselves prevented from partaking in and being able to get that formal training that pushed you to the professional public sphere of a professional artist, if you will, right? The other thing, of course, was that women were often still shown as fragile and delicate. This idea of domestic ideology, right? The role was as a wife and mother. And artists, women artists, not only continue to show this ideal, but they also are going to challenge it as well. So we have a combination of artists that reinforce this domestic ideology that women were supposed to be these kind of docile, delicate housewives that raised children, and that was kind of their entire identity. So the whole emphasis was, of course, on motherhood, the domestic role, right? So this influence setting, of course, a lot of the times the setting was the home, the kitchen. Outdoors could be acceptable as well, because you could still show women in this kind of a delicate setting and fulfilling that domestic role out in an outside setting as well. But these tend to be where you saw women with this. And so, of course, then this was a common thing we saw. Queen Victoria also reinforced that role, right? With the other image that we looked at first, she definitely reinforced that which somewhat is contradictory to her being the queen and running a country, and at the same time reinforcing traditional views of women. And countries certainly follow the leads of the rulers. Nonetheless, you also had women who challenged the system by starting to show women as more complex than just simply mothers in a domestic sphere, and instead highlighted the everyday life, focusing on the role of women outside of the home. And so you had, again, these kind of competing issues. This will get pushed further, right? Earliest kind of challenges were to basically highlight that the domestic life of mother and wife was more complex than just simply existing. And then this will get pushed with the suffrage movement to demand more representation over time to show strong, independent women who challenge those traditional roles. This is also they're also going to be playing with it at the same time, and we're going to talk about this in more detail a little bit later. But the domestic sphere was reinforced with the cult of domesticity. So you're going to hear that word a couple of times. This kind of became a shifting view of what women's roles were with industrialization and the new middle class that had emerged during this time. The Industrial Revolution also helped with an emphasis on now showing middle class women and working women. Right, that it wasn't just the nobility, and that's a huge increase in kind of expectation of roles of women, because it had for so long largely been wealthy women that were depicted in most artistic scenes. So to now be branching out into showing others that were beyond the kind of traditional views of women was significant. Right, the rise of feminism and industrialization both helped with these changing views to provide this kind of, like I said, more nuanced role of women, so that they often started depicting women in scenes reading, writing, and participating in other intellectual activities that was meant to intentionally highlight their agency and intelligence. Women also started showing women in professions that were not traditionally seen as a woman's job. You also have, oops, sorry, dropped my pen there. In this image here, you had artists that attempted to showcase women still as mothers, right? And there's an emphasis on mothers and stuff here, but this is in a more rural coastal region, town, where it shows a woman that isn't, her dress, if you notice, her dress is pretty simplistic. Her hair is wrapped up. She's carrying her children out of the water, but, and while that motherhood image is there, it's also not the depiction of a fragile, delicate woman in the home, but instead a strong, hardworking mother who is taking care of her children in that scene. So you do have this shift in these non-traditional professions, or even just non-traditional roles of motherhood, right? The idea that motherhood is more than just fancy, homes with fancy children and lounging around, which is a lot of the scenes. I mean, this is still the best example if we go back to that. With Queen Victoria, right? Of the children kind of lounging around in very fancy clothing with the mother and father sitting there with their kids. And while, of course, this was a formal portrait, so of course they're going to be doing that, that tended to be in various variations, I don't know a better word for that there at the moment, but there's different variations of this same type of scene that you see over and over again. But here you have a challenge to that, showcasing still motherhood, but in a very different structure of really what the average woman outside of the nobility was experiencing and doing in that process. With this, you also have the growing middle class that I mentioned, that had a response to the significant social and economic changes that took place after industrialization. The middle class emerged as essentially the dominant political and social force. And so you start having novels, plays, paintings, sculptures, and other types of prints showcasing this new middle class view, because they became the largest really social class group in many ways that had that kind of social influence. Again, the largest group that had social influence. Nobility was a rather small percentage of people and always has been. But the middle class, because of industrialization, had expanded significantly. And not only had the middle class increased in wealth due to industrialization, but that also meant that they took on new roles and structure that really hadn't been prevalent in power, at least before this period. So specific views of women competed with each other during this period. And even with the loosening of restrictions on women and professional training that had taken place, they still faced many obstacles to obtaining art instruction that was considered equal to men, right? One of the biggest aspects of this has to do with this debate on femininity and this a belief that too much learning decreased femininity. There's still, of course, this huge expectation that women represented femininity, and so there was a lot of concern about making sure that somehow didn't disappear. And this issue this is a long-standing issue that stays around for a while in that sense. So there was a belief that too much learning again was dangerous and might encourage female sexuality. There is a quote that says, "Does it pay for a young lady of refined, godly household to be urged as the only way of obtaining a knowledge of true art to enter a class where every feeling of maidenly delicacy is violated, where she becomes so hardened to indelicate sights and words, so familiar with the person of degraded women and in the sight of nude males, that no possible art can restore her lost treasure of chaste and delicate thoughts." And this, I'll reread it again just because, again, this is important. This: "Does it pay for a young lady of a refined, godly household to be urged as the only way of obtaining a knowledge of true art to enter a class where every feeling of maidenly delicacy is violated, and where she becomes so hardened to indelicate sights and words, so familiar with the person of degraded women and the sight of nude males, that no possible art can restore her lost treasure of chaste and delicate thoughts." This was stated by a member of the board of directors to the Pennsylvania Academy in 1883. So you have people that were in these positions of power within the art academies. And what is basically being said with this quote is that essentially, if a woman is to go into the same art instruction as men, that it definitely will decrease femininity because of this exposure to inappropriate things. But it's basically saying, is it worth it for a refined lady from a godly household to lose her being chaste and delicate because she's going to be exposed to inappropriate sights, words, and nudes? Right? So that if that's the view, right, that's still taking place, it's not surprising that there was pushback for women, basically suggesting that essentially the art academy would lead to the loss of feminine virtue and chastity. Right? That's basically what it is saying. And so, of course, this question, continuing debates, and the conflicting ideals, expectations, demands, all of this continued to affect women with questions of what was the natural expression of femininity, where there were clear different spheres for men and women, which was a big thing. And we talked about this before, right? Basically, the political and public was male, and the domestic was female. So these spheres, there was a belief that to cross over, for women to cross over into the public sphere, would somehow they would lose all kind of femininity in that process. And so this was at the same time that women's roles were changing, and so these questions did come up with what was the proper role, and as well as, of course, specifically with the middle class, what contributions could middle class women make once they were removed from labor outside of childbirth and motherhood. Middle class women, there was also a significant change with the cult of domesticity and actually just their overall situation. So, what happens with this is that, and this image here showcases what women often found themselves having to do if they were wealthy enough. So again, this was still somewhat limiting to those who were not, but women started taking charge of, in many ways, their education by forming private art clubs where they could do their training with a group of women and study male nudes, whether that was here, which just was sculptures, and later where they would actually hire like a model to come in. Because they were denied the formal academy, they found ways to work around that by essentially having these private lessons that groups of women work together with. So the middle class women ended up, oops, that was that one. The middle class women, one of the things that came up with this was what was their role? Right? What was the purpose or role of women? Sorry, my bird. I should go put him away because he's decided that jumping on stuff is fun. They had a new expectation. So middle class women were now wealthy enough. It was basically a status symbol to not have to go work, and instead be able to stay at home. And in some cases, follow the as much as possible the upper class. Now they couldn't do it completely because they didn't have that kind of wealth. But this idea that there was a shift in labor dynamics in the new middle class, where women were now not working and could afford to stay home and take care of the household and the children. There also was this emphasis on women managing the spending power essentially now within the home because the husband was leaving work. More importantly, prior to industrialization, the husbands worked at home on the farm, and while women were still doing much of the same labor on the home, it was visible. When men now are leaving to go work outside of the home, now women's labor becomes essentially this invisible labor, as it was called, because they're still doing the work of raising the children, of taking care of the household and cleaning and all that type of thing, but it's no longer being seen, where the husband who worked at home on the farm could see these things taking place when he came into the house. Now he's gone the whole day, and it's like this stuff just magically, gets done, and it became called the invisible labor. This image here is looking at waiting for Papa, right? And so it has a wife with her 2 kids as they're looking at waiting for their father to come home from work from the day. So women found their status because of this invisible labor. The other part was not just visible and invisible labor, but that the value in society had moved to wage labor. Prior to industrialization, the value in society was production through the farm and that type of thing. Now you have a shift to wage labor and women having their invisible labor. So they looked to create a situation that will allow them to regain some of that status in society. And what that was the cult of domesticity. There were 4 main areas, and women created this to try to increase their status. They intentionally titled it a noble profession, and that wording was intentional. the idea being, right, that no, it's not just, housewife, which wasn't really the term that was used yet. It's not just, I don't know, motherhood, but there was a series of things that women did within the household as this new middle class, and they wanted to be seen as valued. So it makes sense that a noble profession sounds more important than just job, for example, in that case, right? So with this, the cult of domesticity, the 4 parts. The first was the role of mother. Motherhood, right? There was an expectation and focus on motherhood. That doesn't go away. That always is still women's primary kind of focus. They were supposed to have and raise kids. So that's number 1. The second was that they were to be an economic manager, essentially. And the economic manager was, here, I'll put this here with the terms. Oops. So motherhood, economic manager. And here the finances during industrialization had, they hadn't become volatile, I guess, but I mean, I guess they had. They were not stable. That's the biggest thing. They weren't always volatile, but they weren't stable. The markets were newer. There wasn't a lot of protections or regulations yet, and so prices did fluctuate quite a bit. The other part was that women were now the spenders in the home, right? As their husband was out of work for the day, they were the ones that went and purchased food and other goods for the household. So now they were said that they were supposed to be responsible for managing the finances in the home and providing stability of those finances in the home. The third was that they were the moral center. Women were responsible for maintaining religious instruction and keeping a home that had a religious focus to it. And then lastly, they were supposed to create what was the home as a haven. The new industrialized world was more individualistic than society had before. And this meant many people feeling like it was, outside competition, people getting out to get each other, people taking advantage of each other. So you were so supposed to create this bubble in the home as a haven, as a protective force that men could come back to and escape the kind of difficulties of the outside world, right? And so this is a new kind of way of thinking for women's roles. And this initially is focused mostly in the home. It is going to lead to expansion outside of the home. And what we're going to see is that women artists existed between these contradictory relationships of the middle class, ideas of femininity and the cult of domesticity, and the kind of social identity and competition, and also, of course, the fact that they weren't supposed to be as publicly visible, that was necessary for the success in the arts and education, as well as, of course, reform movements that were looking to push past even beyond the cult of domesticity. And so we see, like I said, a wide variety of art when women, here in this scene, of course, with the cult of domesticity, again, another one showing the motherhood component, right? That you were to first and foremost be a mother, and the role of taking and caring for your children, which again is different from the wealthy, who usually hired governesses and nannies to raise their children. But in the middle class, women, they didn't always do that. Women were more expected to raise and take care of their children themselves. So even if we go back and compare, because I think it makes a good example of this image of motherhood, right, where the mom is involved and active with her kids, versus the much more formal royal portrait, where she's there and her kids are there, but she's not actively, right, you know, she's kind of gazing off at the artist probably, but she's not watching the kids. She does have her arm around one in a sign of affection, which was going to be the heir, which they always did. The heir was always next to him and stuff that way. But the rest of the kids are kind of just on their own, doing their own thing, compared to what we see with the artwork showcasing middle-class women, where they're way more involved with the children. Again, here you can see, right, being way more engaged, and here an actively playful kind of undertone to the mother and the child in that aspect. During the Victorian period, there were several legal changes that did change women's status significantly. Prior to the Divorce Act of 1857, women had almost no rights to seek divorce, and the Married Property Act of 1870, both of these were significant to increasing women's roles. Divorce Act allowed women to get divorced without, prior to this, women could get divorced for only extreme cases where they could initiate divorce. And prior to the Married Women's Property Act, women were not allowed to own their own property or even hold on to their wages once they were married. So this is a huge change. The Divorce Act allowed, like I said, women to get married. This is a political cartoon of the time, and it says divorce court, and then ladies, as there's this huge long line of women supposedly lining up to get divorced with this new act. So of course there was criticism to the Divorce Act here, obviously making the statement that somehow allowing women to initiate divorce would lead to women just willy-nilly divorcing their husbands, which of course didn't take place, but it does showcase the concern and critique of these new laws that took place. The 1850s opened up educational and work reform as well through the Society for Promotion of Employment for Women. So here we have the Society for Promotion of Employment for Women and the Victorian Printing Press, and also the Society of Female Artists. The Society for Female Artists was a place where women were able to exhibit their artwork, and was meant to not be a complete competition to the academies, because it never was going to be able to, but certainly as a way to give women more additional art opportunities in education. Eventually it changed to the Society of Lady Artists, and full membership was restricted to professional women and limited to 23 women. So even when women did try to make some of these changes, there was pushback to this. That was very much, the shift was very much an attempt to limit who could be in the Society of Lady Artists, which unfortunately did limit what they were originally trying to do. But it does show, again, this continued push for trying to increase women's view and options in the art world. There was wider opportunities for exhibiting artwork, which was important for, again, if you want women to have any kind of public notoriety or recognition as artists, you have to be able to exhibit your artwork, and that did increase. Also, women pushed for increase in education, specifically in teaching drawing and painting. A lot of the schools that did allow women, or that opened up for women, though, kind of still tended to structure around that domestic role. The Female Art School of Art and Design was founded in Britain in 1843, but it emphasized not only drawing and painting, but also embroidery, lace making, and dancing and music, all of which were themes of that kind of domestic ideal that women needed to know in order to be successful. Right. It also, unfortunately, even though the initial attempts were to provide female artists with more options and opportunity, it did end up being used as an excuse to not send women to the Royal Academy of Schools. So here you can see actually an example that was drawn of women in this class. Notice how you have a female model that's fully covered, and then you have this sculpture here of a male, the discus thrower, and he's nude in the discus thrower, Greek sculpture, but they've got him covered up with a sheet, right, so that indecency doesn't take place. And of course, the woman that is being drawn is fully clothed. So even when they did provide at least some type of formal training and opportunities, you still, again, had these constant pushbacks and limitations that were problematic. This did lead to collaboration among some women who were frustrated with these limitations and not being allowed to have the full-fledged education that men did, which, as I showed you with the private education here, one of the things that women started doing is that they would have these private sessions where they pulled together, and it wasn't secretive exactly, but it also wasn't advertised openly, where they would have various models come in where they could actually practice in the nude or with just a cloth or with a variety of things that were otherwise prohibited to them. You had the other one too. Why is it doing that there? That was showcasing that we saw that I had earlier that showed them with the sculptures. Here we go with this one. Again, where it's not covered up, right? So that there were different phases, but there were definitely women who had these shared, essentially, sessions where they paid models so they could practice the nude models because it was so essential to becoming a professional artist. The private home also was the center of many works of art during this time because many painted family members and household scenes because that was what was available to them and what they could practice. Of course, this does end up somewhat reinforcing domestic life and feminine virtues in that process. And as we talked about, some women didn't challenge this system at all, and some did. It was argued that women should not focus, or they should focus on these domestic scenes, and because as one critic suggested, we'll come back to that one in just a second. Here, let's go back here. One critic suggested of why the emphasis should be on the domestic sphere was that a woman's power is for rule, not battle, and her sweet intellect is not for invention or creation, but for sweet ordering and arrangement and decision. This is the true nature of home. It is a place of peace, the shelter not only from injury, but from all terror, doubt, and division. So that very much fits in with a part of that is that domestic ideology, but also the cult of domesticity there, right? The idea that women are, the home is this shelter, this place of protection. But so if you have art critics saying that, like, women's, what they should be focusing on is painting of the domestic life, courtship, feminine virtues, because that is what their role is, right? This wasn't just, that was by a male critic, but it was reinforced by women as well. The English Woman's Review, which was a magazine, said, "It may be that in the more heroic and epic works of art, the hand of man is best fitted to excel. Nevertheless, there remain gentle scenes of home interest and domestic care, delineations of refined feeling, and subtle touches of tender emotion with which women artist is eminently entitled to deal." So it's basically saying men are equipped to deal with the artwork of heroic and epic scenes, while women are equipped to deal with home interest, domestic care, refined feelings, and subtle touches of tender emotion. That's where women artists should focus, because that is what they understand and know how to deal. So all of this was, again, constantly coming up with women having to push back against this. So some of the artists that did highlight and showcase this, and some that challenged this, we have Jane Bockett's artwork. She did many images of middle-class women and children at home. And this one is An Afternoon in the Nursery. And what you can see with this is it is a mother with children at home. But if you notice carefully, she's reading, it's a little hard to see, but she's reading a book, right? And as well, her attention is focused on reading. The kids are off to the side playing, but not like with Queen Victoria where they're just kind of existing. No, there's stuff all over the table, all over the floor, on either sides, which is somewhat implying, of course, that this idea that when women focus on their own pleasures, such as reading, chaos can take place, right? It also can show the reality of that as well. Henrietta Ward's view of domestic bliss was evident in her paintings. She came from a family of professional artists, which a lot of, again, these women did. She had a kind of crazy thing. She married at 14 years old to Edward Ward, who was 30. They met when she was 11, and they eloped and caused a family outrage. Her parents were not happy that she married without their permission, and it ended up creating an estrangement for many years where she did not talk to her family. They eventually did reunite, but it took a while. Edward Ward was an artist as well, and she had 8 children, and she very often used her children as her subjects for art, which would make sense because they were there and available. However, she was also supportive of other women artists. She opened a school for women, including royal and aristocratic children. She is probably best known for not just traditional roles of women, but God Save the Queen is one of them. This is the God Save the Queen, where they're presumably singing God Save the Queen. So here you have, again, the children in this kind of idealized setting with the woman playing the piano while the children, in a very organized manner, sing the lyrics. It was both, of course, a reinforcement of royalty, as well as that domestic ideology of the acceptable traditional role of women in the domestic sphere that isn't creating chaos, right? This one is showing domestic sphere with Jane Bockett's one, but it's in a much more not just realistic, but but also, of course, not perfect structure. But it also could be seen as a critique on women pushing the boundaries of what their role was, because of her reading, right? Things are in chaos. But when a woman, follows the proper instruction and life, then things are more peaceful and organized. The Hayler sisters also painted domestic interiors and traditional views of women. Here you have the Feeding of the Swans by Edith Hayler. And again, the key with this, if it's not a critique of women challenging the system, but it's instead meant to reinforce this idealized view and role of women, you have here, right, this very peaceful outdoor scene of a family with the kids very carefully and well-dressed going to feed the swans. You have the proper relationship of husband and wife, and it creates this peaceful and happy scene, right? Just kind of like the painting as with the God Save the Queen as well. So these were ones that were meant to emphasize domesticity and the peace and structure of a well-ordered family. All right, so then those who challenging the subject of art by women, we also had a shift to not going in that direction of reinforcing that domestic ideal. Urban working class women were often not the subjects of paintings during this period, but they are actually starting to be shown more and more in photography. In fact, you're going to have like one of the best known is probably Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Live, that photograph and show poor living and labor conditions of families and women. They are the subjects in Emily Mary Osborne and Rebecca Solomon's work. So in this one, you have Emily Osborne in Home Thoughts, which was meant to emphasize the kind of isolation of a governess. Governesses, right, often traveled far from home when the families went on vacation or trips. And even if they didn't travel, governesses were often not with their own family for much of the time. And so you get not only a look at that kind of working class woman, but also the isolation that comes from basically being part of another family more than you are your own. So, which also you could be a critique on this, right? The middle class domestic ideology, and yet upper middle class hiring these governesses to help raise the kids, and in the process, took away a mother from her kids, right? They of course didn't think about that at the time, but it certainly could be the critique with this as well. And then you'll have also Emily Mary Osborne's Nameless and Friendless. We'll go to this one here. So that's this one. Middle-class women who were unmarried or widowed and had to support themselves is the subject of this, The Nameless and Friendless. That's the title of the artwork, which it shows a young mother with a boy, and she is trying to sell one artwork, and it looks like she has a portfolio that her son is holding on to. She's most likely a widow because this is traditionally mourning clothing, the all black, and so most likely her husband has passed away, and she's trying to sell some of her artwork in order to make money to support them. You can also see the kind of solemn experience with her eyes that are downcast, not looking happy. So, right, instead of the domestic happiness of cheery life with children and the scenes we'd seen before, this one here, right, is a bit more depressing, right? She's certainly not happy. She looks like she's uncomfortable in this situation. And then you have a couple people paying attention to her painting, critiquing it. What is also interesting is you have these two men here, and if you notice, it's hard to see, but on their print is a ballerina dancing. And then they're looking over and somewhat also looking with this kind of look that's critiquing her being in this shop dressed as she is. Right, it's a great contradiction in contrast to the clothing and view of how they're looking at a woman as a ballerina in this print, and how she's being observed and treated in the kind of mourning clothes trying to sell her artwork. And this idea of essentially that women were to be the focus of art, but not the artist themselves, right? And so that certainly is critiquing somewhat of, again, these contradictory views of women, and also, of course, showing a not so happy positive side of women being forced to try to somehow find a way to support themselves in a situation where they now are no longer are married and don't have that support, and that it is a struggle, that it is difficult, that it is more work to do. Okay, with that then, we also have another painting that takes into account the working class and those conditions of underpaid female labor, with Anna Blunden's The Seamstress. It's also sometimes called the One Short Hour. So you can find it under the title The Seamstress or One Short Hour. This was very much a depiction of the working class and the struggle and difficulty in the working class. So it is, you have the seamstress here, her hands are clasped as she's looking out into the sky of the morning coming. She's working, if you notice here, on this fancy shirt, this silk shirt, which obviously she's sewing, not something that she could afford. Also, you get the kind of industrialized buildings. So the changing landscape and industrialization has created the situation where she had been working all night to mend this shirt, and is now taking a moment, gazing out, somewhat idealizing the outside world. It certainly is meant to highlight the kind of exhaustion and unhappiness of this labor while she's kind of, for a short little bit, as the dawn cracks, dreaming about something different. There was a poem that was accompanied this when this artwork was exhibited, and the poem, The Song of the Shirt, this is where the One Short Hour title comes from. The Song of the Shirt, so it says, oh, but to breathe the breath of the cowslip and primrose sweet, with the sky above my head and the grass beneath my feet, for only one short hour to feel as I used to feel before I knew the woes of want and the walk that cost meals. So again, one of the changes was pastoralism that came with industrialization. Many started to idealize the rural nature, which makes sense because cities began to change, and early factories were pretty dirty and dingy, and the cities didn't have any of the resources for cleaning up garbage and other things like that. And people began to idealize the rural life, even though farm work was hard life as well. And so this poem kind of reinforces that idea, right? To be able to breathe the sweet, fresh air of the country, right, and not be inside this house cloistered in, but have the sky above the head, grass walking on their feet, for one short hour to be able to feel. So saying, feel how before I used to feel, before I knew the woes of want, right? So this wishing for a better life before being forced into this harsher and kind of soul-breaking labor. So you do get, like I said, this depiction of the working class woman, which is very different. Both of these that we just looked at from the kind of domestic ideal that was also being expressed at the same time. Now, another area of was women and sexuality and how they were portrayed there. The theme of women's labor connects with that of female sexuality and men's control over women's bodies specifically. The domestic sphere and emphasis of the middle class was often contrasted to that of a prostitute or even just generally unregulated female sexuality. And they specifically saw in many cases as prostitution was inseparable from marriage customs. Here you have this semi-cartoon / political cartoons that were popular in the day, and it's of a prostitute leading the man into this leering kind of man into the room. It says, touch for touch, a female physician in full practice. So one of the things though is this is also like targeting with the it's making a joke because women weren't physicians back then, and so of course arguing a physician is checking over the body, but it's somewhat degrading even that women's potential of women's profession, right? Women can't be physicians. The only type of physician is a prostitute who's inspecting a man's body. And so this was treated, and there's lots of different views. There's ones of like the fallen woman, and the idea of it not being this meant to be funny, tongue-in-cheek kind of image in art of women, but one where it's serious about women being, the downfall and problems of prostitution. Interestingly enough, almost all images of prostitution were drawn by men. We only have one that we know of women, or of a woman artist, Anna Mary Howitt, who her painting was titled "The Castaway," but the painting has actually been lost, so we don't have an image of it. All we have left is a description of it from someone who saw it when it was on display. It said the painting was described as a rather strong-minded subject involving a dejected female, which would have been the prostitute, mud with lilies dying in it, a dust heap, and other details. So that is the only remaining description we have of her artwork. And we don't actually have the painting anymore because it's been lost. One of the reasons why women did take an interest in prostitution, and even why there was this connection between middle-class women and prostitution, was the cult of domesticity. Because eventually the cult of domesticity went beyond the home, and the specific place that it was with motherhood. Right? What if you didn't have kids? What if you didn't have any type of kids in the home anymore? So let's say you were either too young or couldn't have kids, or let's say your kids were grown. What was your role then if you no longer had that function of motherhood? Well, one was this idea of society, and that women should look to take care of society. And then you also have moral reform, or moral center. I'll get this to right, which also went to social reform. So you had two areas that eventually, as the cult of domesticity continued, middle-class women expanded to increase essentially what they could do. And so one of the things that took place is that middle-class women started looking to provide goods and resources to prostitutes as part of that societal taking care of, right? If you weren't taking care of your children, then you were taking care of society. And they would go and try to get women out of prostitution by not only providing resources, but talking to them and trying to give them opportunities in other aspects that they could use to no longer be part of that. This whole idea of the of prostitution very much was part of this contrast between virginity and prostitution as well. Which of course meant that it's probably one of the reasons why we don't have too many female artists that tackled prostitution, because it was this idea of you were either kind of, the ideal kind of virgin, virtuous woman, or the fallen prostitute. And it ultimately didn't have a lot for nuance beyond that. Not surprisingly, male artists tended to like to show images of prostitution in kind of sexually explicit ways for the time, or at least to be slightly raunchy, if you will. Something like this cartoon and stuff in it, right? It didn't usually depict women in a positive light. And so women tended to see that they were supposed to help reform prostitution, but not necessarily paint images of prostitution. And it seemed many women were interested in painting them in a super negative or critical light. Thus, that tended to be more focused on male artists. But you get all of these views of women in this contrast between the two. And even the idea that prostitution was inseparable from society. There was a quote that in the Westminster Review that said, "Prostitution is as inseparable from our present marriage customs as the shadow from the substance. They are two sides of the same shield," right? So this idea that you can't have one without the other was definitely a common view, because of course it was more acceptable for men to engage with prostitution, but it was not acceptable for women to be prostitutes. So again, those contradictions that took place. Another topic was animals and women. Animal paintings became some of the most popular and viewed and reproduced art of the time. Queen Victoria commissioned women artists to create portraits of her royal dogs. In general, Victorian society had a special place for domesticated animals. There also are going to be some aspects of this. Images of animals frequently symbolize vices and virtues of women. So it gets connected to women in the artwork itself. You have this one here. We'll go with this. This is from a male artist, which we'll show the difference. So I'm going to go back to this one in just a second with this. This is Rosa. Oops. Let me just skip. This is Rosa's artwork here, the horse fair. And all of her stuff was much more about natural wild scenes, animals, and natural settings, right? Where you have this one here, which was called A Pet. And as you can see, it's a woman kissing a small bird cage. And it was somewhat seen as this kind of sensual act. At least that's how many men saw it. Again, a quote for this, that on observing this painting. But after all, it is only questionable kindness to make a pet of a creature so essential volatile. Right? This idea that, it was a woman, two parts, woman taming the volatile, wild nature of this bird, but also this kind of sensual stance of it's the cage replacing the man, right? She's kissing the cage. You could have easily painted in a man standing there next to her and it would have a similar effect. So you tended to have male artists that often utilized animal imagery to equate to a woman's vices or virtues, but many women artists focused on animals just in their kind of natural scene. This also coincided with pushing for animal rights and treatment of animals, which also coincided with this kind of, right, if animals are controlled and abused, is it not similar to how women are controlled and abused? And so women saw the push for animal rights as somewhat connected to the push for women's rights as well. Rosa was like the most famous woman artist of the period. Oops, I skipped ahead for that. There we go. She ended up coming to England in 1856, and following a super successful visit with showcasing the horse fair, as displayed here, she ends up spending a year in the Paris Salon. Her father was also a painter who helped teach her art. He actually believed at a very young age, he had written that she was going to be a painter. She was actually very much pushing against a lot of these restrictions on women. She wore male clothing, and which was seen as highly unusual and inappropriate at the time. She did not dress up. She didn't often wear makeup. She pushed all of these gender boundaries out in the open and was able to in many ways because she became so popular and famous and well known with her artwork. But certainly that was talked about as much as her artwork itself in that. Her paintings often showed animals, like I said, in, again, these nature scenes that romanticize the pastoral period, that looked to showcase the beauty of animals in nature versus compared to the cage bird in that tiny, tiny cage. Instead of humans controlling and caging animals, it showing them in their natural life. Or at least out in the wild and open more than that. Some are also showing the humans, in this case with the horse fair, having trouble controlling nature and the horses. So it's not surprising that there would be a connection between that, animals, and also men and how they try to control women and lock them up and have that type of authority and control over that. Right. Rosa's paintings represented animals' freedom, their somewhat uncorrupted nature, their loyalty and courage. And the reality is, whether or not connected to women's roles, most people in England at the time enjoyed seeing that. And part of that had to do, again, with that pastoral ideal. Again, with industrialization, there was a look back and a longing to the past before industrialization. And her images often kind of depicted pre-industrial scenes, or at least areas that weren't touched by the industrialized city. And then lastly, we have women wore in historical paintings. So one of the areas that was seen as predominantly a male-based system was the history paintings. That was largely for men. War paintings were also seen largely for men, as women weren't, supposed to be part of the war. Certainly not. There was definitely this idea that women weren't supposed to be exposed to the horrors of war in this way. So to push into the historical paintings, the war paintings, that's very much an intentional, I want to move into the male sphere of painting. That was much harder for women to move into than what we've seen with the domestic examples of art here. Elizabeth Thompson was very similar to Rosa in that she refused to be restricted by these feminine rules and structures. She painted the world of war, soldiers' lives, again, things that had largely been restricted to men. And so that's significant. She came from a wealthy family. She had a father who supported female education and actively supported his two daughters in all of their academic endeavors. She started oil painting lessons first and enrolled in the Female School of Art, but she left because she wasn't interested in the design part of it, right? She didn't want that to. She didn't care about that component. Her most she also actually participated in draped life class and private classes of nude male models, and so they sometimes called them undraped female life classes. But all it was is essentially, I showed you earlier, the private classes where women would hire a model themselves with a group of women who wanted to do the study that were not permitted to do so. So she pushed all the boundaries in trying to get the same education and experiences as male artists would, even if she had to go in a kind of roundabout way to do it. Her biggest success and that kind of thrust her into stardom was calling the role after an engagement in 1874, which is this painting here, and is showcasing men during the Crimea War and the exhaustion and injuries and just the difficulties of war in that process. That was weird. Hang on just a second. There we go. It was the PowerPoint had decided to auto do something there. It didn't make much of a change, but all of a sudden I saw it like shrink down for a second. This painting again kind of like propelled her into not only a success but being known as a professional artist and actually really a celebrity in the art world. Her painting toured nationwide and attracted huge audiences. There were multiple reprints of not only her image, but of this painting that people purchased because it was so popular. The other, of course, component that made it unique is, and you can't tell here from the PowerPoint, but it was significantly large in size, which again, the massively large canvases tended to be reserved for male artists. So not only was she painting in a topic largely reserved for male artists, but the size, the scope, all of those things, and even her celebrity, all fit in more with a male artist trajectory than a woman. And yet she was able to garner significant success in that area. She ends up marrying Major William Butler in 1877, which did coincide with her decline in celebrity status, which wasn't uncommon for women once they got married because she ended up becoming a mother, a wife. Also, because she was a military wife, they moved around quite a bit for his active duty. And that ultimately makes it harder to be present in public in the art world itself. Nonetheless, she did actually move towards drawings and watercolors of the various foreign posts. She was in Egypt and Africa, and she detailed numerous drawings and watercolors depicting not only the British Empire and colonial control, but non-European countries and the peoples that she visited. And this was important. This became an important aspect actually for other artists, male artists. So not only did she shift into that aspect because it worked with her new lifestyle of moving around to different military posts, but also so did Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was an upper-class Englishwoman. She ended up living in Constantinople as the wife of the ambassador to Turkey. And she also displayed, not only wrote and described like Turkish women, but also drew and sketched aspects of daily life. Her letters home provided details of descriptions and images of Turkish harems, bathhouses, and other topics that actually men couldn't even if men had been there, they wouldn't have had access to. So one of the things that was significant is she provided a view into not only a foreign country where, you know, there was obviously very Eurocentric ideas about what these people looked like and did, but she provided access and visual examples to a population of male artists and men in general that otherwise wouldn't know much about that topic or be able to see anything from it. The other thing that tended to be common with this is that women tended to present non-European women through their own unique perspective as a woman. And while they certainly still had their Eurocentric view, they tended to not other them in the same way that men did. And they certainly, she also tended to emphasize where like these Turkish women were able to participate and act and challenge the traditional views and roles of Victorian women, and showcase a different style of living and opportunity and options for women, which is significant as well because many male artists use these books and illustrations for their own artwork. Right? They had never been to Turkey, they had never been to Constantinople, they'd never been to Egypt. And so these women who provided these kind of anthropological sketches and descriptions, again, still with a Eurocentric viewpoint. However, women tended to, again, not other them in the same way. They were less inclined to portray them with common themes of cruelty and eroticism that male artists tended to do. So it provided a more accurate description. Sometimes they romanticized them as well. And there certainly was sometimes racism that was connected to it as well. But the level and amount that they did was far less than what male artists did. Plus, again, as I mentioned, all of these travel books that were both writings and illustrations provided a view and perspective of women, which is who they often showcased, in children, that male artists would have not had access to, and allowed for many of them to create these portraits that otherwise would not have existed because they never would have had some of the initial views and examples to base their artwork on. And it ultimately provided a more accurate and robust view of non-European regions to Britain as well. Okay, that's where we're going to end for today for part 1, and we will continue looking at this in part 2 in the next